It was the richest morning Lisbon had ever seen. November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. The streets were empty, not because the city was poor, but because everyone was in church. Merchants, noblemen, ministers all gathered to celebrate one of the holiest days in the Catholic calendar. Portugal at this moment was not just a country. It was an empire. Gold from Brazil flowed through Lisbon's veins. Spices from India filled her warehouses. Her ships had mapped the globe. She was one of the most powerful nations on earth. Then, at 9:40 in the morning, the ground opened up. And in 6 minutes, everything was gone? To understand what was lost on November 1st, 1755, you first have to understand what Portugal had built. This was a nation of barely 1 million people, smaller than Indiana, that had assembled an empire stretching across 4 continents. It started with the voyages of the 15th century. Prince Henry the Navigator, Vasco Gama, Bartolomeu Dias. These weren't just explorers. They were architects of the first truly global economy. Portugal found sea routes that defined world trade for the next 300 years. By the 1500s, Portugal controlled the spice trade from India. By the 1600s, it dominated the sugar trade from Brazil. And by the mid-1700s, just decades before our story, something extraordinary happened underground in Minas Gerais, Brazil. Gold, mountains of it. Between 1700 and 1755, Brazil shipped an estimated 800 to 1,000 metric tons of gold to Lisbon. To put that in perspective, that was roughly equivalent to all the gold Spain had extracted from its American colonies in the previous 2 centuries. Lisbon became the wealthiest city in Europe, perhaps the wealthiest city on the planet. The waterfront district, the Baixa, was a marvel of Baroque architecture. The Palace of Ribera sat directly on the River Tagus. The Royal Library housed over 70,000 volumes, one of the finest collections in the world. The cathedral, the opera house, the grand squares filled with fountains and gold-adorned churches. Lisbon was Rome with a harbor. King João V, who had ruled Portugal until just 3 years before the earthquake, spent so lavishly that historians still marvel at his excess. He once sent a single gold chandelier to Rome that weighed over a ton. He built the convent of Mafra, an enormous palace monastery, employing 45,000 workers over 13 years. When the Pope gave him the title Most Faithful King, João celebrated with a month-long festival. By 1755, Portugal's new king was José I, a gentler man who preferred opera to politics. He had inherited the richest empire in the world and showed little interest in the machinery that maintained it. That machinery was about to be destroyed. November 1st was a perfect day to be inside a church. And nearly everyone was. The streets of Lisbon were unusually quiet for a Saturday morning. Merchants had shuttered their shops. Fishermen had docked their boats. Even the servants of the wealthy had been given the morning off to attend Mass. It was All Saints' Day. At exactly 9:40 a.m., something 200 kilometers off the coast of Portugal shifted. The Azores-Gibraltar Fault zone, one of the most geologically volatile boundaries on Earth, had been accumulating stress for centuries. On this particular morning, it released. The magnitude has been estimated by modern seismologists at somewhere between 8.5 and 9.0. To put that in context, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, which triggered the Fukushima nuclear disaster, measured 9.1. This was that big. The first tremor hit Lisbon and lasted somewhere between 3.5 to 6 minutes, though survivors reported it feeling like an eternity. The royal palace on the waterfront collapsed. The famous opera house, which had only opened 6 months earlier, gone. The cathedral. The roof caved in on the congregation. 85% of Lisbon's buildings were destroyed in those first minutes. Libraries, hospitals, government archives, cathedrals, the homes of the rich and the shacks of the poor, all of it fell. But the earthquake alone would not have been the catastrophe that history remembers. 30 to 40 minutes after the shaking stopped, the survivors who had run to the waterfront noticed something strange. The harbor was draining. The River Tagus was pulling back from its banks, exposing the muddy seabed. Fish flapped on the exposed riverbed. For those who didn't know what this meant, it seemed like a miracle. It was not a miracle. The tsunami hit in 3 waves. The first one reached 6 meters in some areas. The second, the most powerful, reportedly crested at 15 to 20 meters along certain coastal stretches. It traveled up the Tagus River and slammed into the heart of the city. The waterfront district was obliterated. Then came the third disaster. The earthquake had toppled thousands of candles, lanterns, and cooking fires. Lisbon in 1755 was a medieval city of narrow streets and wooden construction. It burned for 5 days. By the time the fires died, the city that had been the jewel of the Atlantic was ash, rubble, and mud. The official death toll estimates range from 30,000 to 60,000. People in a city of roughly 200,000. Between 15 and 30% of Lisbon's entire population was dead within a week. The true number may never be known. The archives that might have recorded births, deaths, property records, tax receipts, trade agreements, they burned. History tends to focus on the human tragedy of the Lisbon earthquake, and rightly so. Tens of thousands of people dead. Families destroyed. A civilization's cultural heritage reduced to rubble. But to understand why this earthquake didn't just devastate Portugal, it permanently altered the global balance of power. You have to follow the money. Because what burned on November 1st, 1755 was not just a city. It was the financial nervous system of an empire. Let's break down exactly what was lost. First, the physical destruction. Modern economists estimate the material damage at somewhere between 32% and 48% of Portugal's annual GDP. Imagine today if nearly half of America's entire yearly economic output simply vanished overnight. That's the scale we're talking about. The Baixa, the commercial heart of Lisbon, was completely destroyed. This wasn't just buildings. This was the location of the major trading houses, the merchant banks, the warehouses full of colonial goods, and most critically, the contracts, records, and financial instruments that organized Portugal's entire trade empire. Think about what those records meant. In the 18th century, there was no digital backup. There was no cloud storage. Every trade agreement with an Indian merchant, every debt owed by a Brazilian plantation owner, every tax receipt from a colonial governor, all of it existed on paper. And almost all of that paper was in Lisbon, and now it was ash. Second, the immediate economic paralysis. Lisbon was not just Portugal's capital. It was the only significant port in Portugal. All colonial trade flowed through it. When the harbor was destroyed and the commercial district reduced to rubble, Portuguese trade simply stopped. Ships stopped coming. Merchants stopped buying. The mechanism of empire seized like an engine without oil. Third, and perhaps most devastating in the long run, the loss of human capital. Among the dead were some of Portugal's most experienced merchants, administrators, and navigators. Men who carried decades of knowledge in their heads, knowledge of trade routes and local contacts in India and Brazil. They held the complex financial relationships that held the empire together. That institutional knowledge, that expertise died with them. Fourth, the debt spiral. Rebuilding Lisbon required money, enormous amounts of money. King José I and his chief minister, the Marquis of Pombal, immediately began borrowing. From British merchants, from Dutch banks, from anyone who would lend. But here's the brutal irony. The Brazilian gold that made Portugal wealthy was also the source of its greatest vulnerability. Portugal never built a domestic manufacturing economy. Why make things when you have so much gold to buy from others? British and Dutch merchants had captured the Portuguese market. By 1755, Portugal extracted wealth from colonies and immediately spent it on foreign manufactured goods, creating a cycle of dependency. The British in particular had embedded themselves deeply into Portuguese trade through the Methuen Treaty of 1703. This agreement gave British woolens preferential access to Portuguese markets. In exchange for Portugal's wines getting preferred access to Britain, on paper it seemed balanced. In practice, Portugal exported raw materials and gold, importing finished goods from Britain. This created a classic dependency trap, weakening its economic independence. When the earthquake hit, Portugal needed to rebuild. It turned to its primary trading partner, Britain. The British response was actually remarkably swift and generous. They sent food, building materials, and supplies. But 18th century generosity came with strings. British merchants used Portugal's vulnerability. They negotiated even more favorable trading terms, cementing their economic dominance. Portugal rebuilt on borrowed money and foreign supplies. Every brick laid in New Lisbon was another link in the chain of dependency, deepening its economic ties. In the chaos after the earthquake, as fires burned and survivors wandered through rubble, King José I asked his chief minister what should be done amidst the devastation. The Marquis of Pombal, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, would define this era. He gave what may be the most famous answer in the history of disaster management: bury the dead, feed the living, build the city. Pombal was not a gentleman. He was methodical, ruthless, and possessed of a clarity that could be mistaken for coldness. He understood exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. He moved with extraordinary speed. Within hours of the earthquake, he had organized tent cities for the homeless, dispatched troops to prevent looting, and begun organizing the removal of rubble. Within weeks, he had drawn up plans for an entirely new Lisbon, a modern, rational, grid-patterned city built on Enlightenment principles. The new Baixa, the commercial heart of the rebuilt Lisbon, was a masterpiece of urban planning. Wide streets, uniform building heights, earthquake-resistant construction techniques that are now recognized as proto-seismic engineering. Pombal essentially invented the concept of seismically resistant urban design 2.5 centuries before it became standard practice. But Pombal's ambitions went far beyond architecture. He understood that Portugal's long-term problem wasn't just rebuilding a city. It was restructuring an economy that had made Portugal perpetually dependent on foreign powers. He began a sweeping series of reforms. He created state-backed trading companies to capture more of the colonial trade for Portugal rather than letting foreign merchants skim the profits. He invested in Portuguese manufacturing, textiles, ceramics, glass, trying to build the domestic production capacity that centuries of easy colonial gold had made unnecessary. He cracked down on the Catholic Church, which controlled enormous wealth and had used the earthquake as a propaganda opportunity. When the Jesuit priest Gabriel Malagrida publicly declared that the earthquake was God's punishment for Lisbon's sinfulness, Pombal didn't just disagree. He eventually had Malagrida tried by the Inquisition and burned at the stake. Pombal used the earthquake to break the political power of the Jesuits in Portugal entirely, expelling the entire order. He also moved against the old aristocracy, noble families who used their proximity to the king to maintain monopolies and block modernization. He crushed them, sometimes literally. When a noble family was implicated in an assassination attempt against King José, Pombal used it as a pretext to execute or imprison dozens of his political enemies. Pombal was, in short, an 18th-century authoritarian modernizer. The earthquake gave him his opening. But here's the painful truth about Pombal's project. It largely failed. The state trading companies he created were often inefficient and corrupt. Manufacturing investments were too little, too late. To compete with Britain's emerging industrial revolution, constant borrowing to fund reconstruction loaded Portugal with debt. By the time Pombal fell from power after King José's death in 1777, arrested and prosecuted by the new queen, Maria I, Portugal had a beautiful new capital city and a fundamentally unchanged economic structure. The dependency on British trade, the reliance on Brazilian gold, the lack of domestic industry, all of it remained. The Lisbon earthquake didn't just change Portugal, it changed the world. The 18th century was the Age of Enlightenment, a period when European intellectuals believed the universe was rational, that God had designed a logical, ordered world, that natural disasters, properly understood, had natural explanations. And then a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck on All Saints' Day, killing tens of thousands of the most devout Catholic believers in Europe while they knelt in prayer, and sparing the brothels and criminal quarters on the outskirts of the city that had been emptied on a holiday morning. The philosopher Voltaire was living in Geneva when news arrived. He was already skeptical of organized religion. But the Lisbon earthquake broke something in him and in European thought more broadly. His response, the satirical novel Candide, published in 1759, brutally mocked the optimistic philosophy of Leibniz. who had famously argued that we live in the best of all possible worlds. The earthquake made that claim obscene. The Lisbon earthquake became a turning point in Western philosophy. It accelerated the shift from religious explanations of natural disasters towards secular, scientific ones. It weakened the Church's moral authority at a moment when that authority was already under pressure. It contributed to the climate of skepticism that would, within 30 years, help ignite the French Revolution. On the geopolitical level, the earthquake accelerated a shift in Atlantic power that was already underway. Portugal's weakening created a vacuum. Britain filled it. British merchants, already deeply embedded in Portuguese trade, extended their reach further into Brazil and the Portuguese colonial system. The earthquake didn't create British economic dominance, but it turbocharged it. Meanwhile, in the Americas, the earthquake had another indirect but profound consequence. The Jesuits whom Pombal expelled from Portugal and its colonies had been, in many cases, the most effective colonial administrators in Brazil, and the most vocal opponents of indigenous slavery. Their removal opened the Brazilian interior to more aggressive and exploitative development, more slaves, more gold extraction, more environmental destruction. The economic and demographic consequences of that shift are still being studied by historians today. In 1807, 52 years after the earthquake, Napoleon's armies invaded Portugal. The Portuguese royal family didn't fight, they fled. They loaded onto British warships and sailed to Brazil, making the colony the temporary capital of the empire. It was the ultimate symbol of Portugal's diminished status, a once mighty empire dependent on British naval protection. Brazil declared independence in 1822, and with it went the gold, the sugar, the economic engine that had powered the empire. Portugal was now a small country on the edge of Europe, with no industrial revolution, no major colonies, and enormous debts. The 19th century for Portugal was a story of political instability, economic stagnation, and repeated financial crises. The country lurched between monarchy and republic, between progressive reformers and conservative reaction. In 1910, the monarchy was overthrown and a republic established. In 1926, a military coup brought authoritarian rule. From 1932 to 1968, Portugal was governed by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, one of Europe's longest-serving dictators. He maintained a tight grip on the economy, kept Portugal deliberately poor but stable, and held on to African colonies. Portugal's African colonial wars consumed its resources and led to the Carnation Revolution of 1974, restoring democracy. When Portugal joined the European Community in 1986, it was one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. The recovery since then has been real. Lisbon today is a thriving, beautiful city. Portugal has developed a services economy, a tourism industry, and a growing technology sector. It joined the Eurozone. It weathered the 2008 financial crisis, though with great pain. But by any measure, Portugal is a footnote. A country of 10 million people on the edge of a continent with a beautiful history and a modest present. History loves single causes. We want clean stories, one event, one turning point, one moment where everything changed. The Lisbon earthquake is tempting in that way. November 1st, 1755. 6 minutes. An empire lost. But the honest historian has to say, the earthquake didn't create Portugal's vulnerability, it revealed it. The dependency on Brazilian gold, the structural reliance on British trade, the lack of domestic industry, the enormous wealth flowing in and flowing straight back out to foreign merchants. These were the weaknesses that made Portugal fragile. The earthquake was the match. But the powder had been laid for decades. This is a lesson that echoes through economic history with uncomfortable regularity. Nations, companies, and households that build prosperity on a single commodity or trade partner are always more fragile than they appear. When a shock arrives, it turns out to have been dependency all along. Pombal understood this. He tried to build something more resilient, a Portugal with manufacturing with domestic capacity. He was centuries ahead of his time in thinking about economic resilience. He failed, partly due to politics and destruction, partly because Britain's industrial revolution was accelerating, making catching up nearly impossible. But the attempt matters. Because even in the worst catastrophe, there are choices to be made. There is agency. The earthquake was not destiny. It was a disaster. And disasters are also moments of possibility. The city that rose from the ashes of November 1755 was not the same as the one that fell. It was smaller in ambition, more modest in its dreams of global empire, humbler in the knowledge of what a single morning can take away. But it was there. It was standing. And it still is. If you found this video compelling, there's something I want you to sit with. The wealthiest empire in the world. Destroyed not just by an earthquake, but by the economic structure it had spent 200 years building. All the gold in Brazil couldn't save it. History's greatest disasters are rarely just natural. They are always underneath about the choices made long before the ground shook. If you enjoyed this documentary, hit subscribe. We cover history, economics, and geopolitics through the lens of the stories that shaped our world. And drop a comment below. Which empires collapsed do you want us to cover next?